Right, so today we're talking about terrestrial ecosystems, climate, and biomes. And I thought that it would be almost impossible to talk about these ecosystems without talking about climate. Because you may have assumed that you can just kind of figure out what the climate of an area is going to be like, or what biomes are going to be in an area, just because of the latitude, or sort of the relative position on the Earth away from the North or South Pole. But you can't just use latitude to determine where these biomes are going to be, because as you can see here's rainforest, and it's at the same latitude as like the Sahara Desert, one of the most arid and inhospitable places on Earth, compared to, these hot spots of biodiversity. Anyway, the point I'm making here is you can't just use the latitude of a place to figure out what biome or what climate is going to be there. And I also wanted to talk for a second about the differences between weather and climate. Weather is local. Weather can be measured, over a span of a few hours or a few days. You can say things like, what's the weather outside like today? You can't say things like, what's the climate like outside today? Climate it's a more general pattern, and climate goes from more like decades to thousands of years. Can climate have an impact on the local weather? Absolutely. But just because it's snowing outside today, or just because it's cold outside in March or whenever it is, doesn't mean that climate change isn't a thing. These are related concepts, but I just wanted to point out that they are very much not the same. So climate varies in different parts of the Earth because of patterns, I should say mostly because of patterns of global air circulation and oceanic currents. That basically what those are doing is they're distributing heat and they're distributing water in the atmosphere, and those are driven, or the oceanic oceanic currents and air circulations are principally driven by three major things: the uneven heating of the Earth, the Earth's rotation, and the different properties of air, water, and land. Let's see, I think I have a picture. So yeah. So as you can see, at the equator, air is heated much more. So, the Earth rotates on an axis, it is tilted, but the sun is hitting the equator pretty uniformly no matter what season it is. And so because of those differences in energy, the sunlight's coming in at a different angle here, depending on what season it is. What I'm saying here is that there is much more sunlight at the equator year round. And these differences in energy explain why tropical regions are hot and why polar regions are cold, and why temperate regions like where we live have this sort of intermediate average temperature. We also have the Earth's rotation on its axis. And so because of the way, I guess, just globes work, the Earth spins faster at the equator than it does at its poles. And as a result, heated air masses rising above the equator move north and south. The cooler areas are deflected to the east or the west. This is called the Coriolis effect. Let's see, this is maybe an even better picture. Because of the way the Earth is spinning, instead of this air heading in a straight line, it gets deflected. Okay, and that's another thing that again is leading to air currents. It's leading to winds on our planet. The next thing is properties of air, water, and land, and basically what's happening with that is that heat from the sun is evaporating ocean water and transferring heat from the oceans that absorb a lot of heat into the atmosphere, especially near the equator where there's lots of energy from the sun. And this evaporation creates these big convection cells like the one you see here. And these convection cells circulate air, heat, and moisture vertically and sort of like from place to place horizontally. So vertically, They're moving water and they're moving heat up and down, and they also move water from place to place like that. And again, this is resulting from Earth's air circulation pattern, prevailing winds, and the configuration of the continents and oceans. They give us these big cells. I'm not going to have you memorize. In previous courses, I've had students memorize what these cells are called, and you don't need to. You should just know that the Earth is sort of broken up into these different sort of zones, like this one, these 6 zones where air is moving around. And so again, it's not quite as simple as just figuring out what the latitude of a place is. And you can see here, you have these desert regions next to these forest regions because of the way this air is circulating on the planet. So yeah, you have 3 cells in the northern hemisphere and 3 cells in the southern hemisphere. And again, because of the way in which these things move around precipitation and move around heat, they lead to this sort of irregular distribution of climates, deserts, grasslands, and forests. And again, it explains why one area of the Earth's land surface is a desert, another is a grassland, another is a forest, and why global air circulation accounts for these different types of forests. And we're going to talk about the different types of forests, grasslands, and deserts as well. We also, while we're in this section, I wanted to talk about the rain shadow effect. And basically what happens is in the rain shadow effect, you have these areas near oceans typically, although you will see some of this near like enormous lakes. But you have prevailing winds are picking up water from an ocean, and then on the windward side, you have forests. And on the leeward side, there is basically not a lot of water left over at the end. So these clouds come up from the ocean, they rain, and by the time they get to the leeward side, there's nothing left. If you want to see a very, very dramatic example of this, go to Sonora Pass. Drive from the western Sierra into the eastern Sierra, and you can see fairly immediately a change in what the forest looks like. And if you continue driving east, very soon you'll be in high desert. So, the shape of the Earth, mountains can cause different biomes because of the way that rain falls on one side and doesn't make it to the other. So this is a generalized effect of latitude on climate and biomes. And parallel changes in vegetation type occur when you travel from the equator to the poles or from lowlands to mountains. And so what I mean by this is as you get higher and higher in elevation, you are going to see things that look more like stuff when you head further and further north. I can kind of account for this. My brother lives in Alaska, and when I visited him in years past, you have coniferous forests taking place very, very low. Even though you're at sea level at Anchorage, you're going to see coniferous forests happening there. And, in order for us to find coniferous forests, we need to go up into the Sierra Nevada typically, or you can find some of these in the coastal range as well, but you need to go up in order to find these things, or you need to go north in order to find these things. So there's just like another factor that plays into why you have different biomes in different areas. So the next topic we're going to talk about is deserts. And what's the definition of a desert? The definition of a desert means that there's very, very low precipitation every year, and it's usually sort of scattered unevenly throughout the year. And, deserts, just because we think of them as being very hot places, can also be quite cold. As we're going to talk about, there are 3 different kinds of desert. But a combination of low rainfall and different average temperatures creates tropical, temperate, and cold deserts. So the first one we're going to talk about is tropical deserts like the Sahara. These are dry and hot throughout most of the year. They have a few plants, but life is pretty sparse in these places. So when you're thinking of deserts, or when you're thinking of tropical deserts, you should probably be thinking about like sandstorm, because people are driving out into these tropical deserts and they're breaking up the hard crust that used to exist there. And that's causing basically a lot more sandstorms taking place there, in addition to like droughts and things associated with global climate change. So here's our precipitation down here, obviously very low. Here's our mean temperature, which is quite hot. The next type of desert we have is temperate deserts. These are ones that are near and dear to my heart, like the Mojave Desert. And they get really hot in the winter, and they get really cold. They get really hot in the summer, and they get really cold in the winter. And they have more rainfall than tropical deserts, as you can see here, and it's sort of distributed throughout the year. And so these tend to have more life, and you'll see things like drought-resistant shrubs or cacti. You'll also see a lot of really cool snakes and lizards out at places like this. And I just want to contrast that. You'll see the temperature is kind of, it's a little bit peakier here, but it's a little bit cooler in these temperate deserts, and there's more rainfall here. The last type of desert we're going to see is the cold desert. This would be places like the Gobi Desert in Asia. Vegetation very sparse in places like the Gobi. Winters are very cold, and summers are warm or hot. Precipitation is low, as you can see. As with all of these deserts, plants have different adaptations that help them to stay cool and get enough water to survive. Kind of one of the more important parts about this is that desert ecosystems are really fragile. In order for things like their soils to recover, it can take like hundreds of years, decades, if not hundreds of years. So, if somebody, takes their four-wheeler off-road through the desert, they can mess up stuff really, really bad. It's because they have really slow plant growth. They have really low species diversity. It takes a long time for their nutrients to cycle, like we talked about before, because they have low bacterial activity, because it's so hot, so cold, and so dry. So, these ecosystems are quite fragile, and they can take a very, very long time to recover from any kind of disturbance. You're going to notice a theme here. We're talking about grasslands now, and there are three different kinds of grasslands: tropical, temperate, and cold. These are usually on the interiors of continents and areas that are. It's like when you see grasslands, it's because there's too much water for it to be called a desert, but it's too dry for a forest to grow there. The reason that forests don't move into these places is because they are seasonally very dry. You have large herbivores that graze there, and so they would eat trees that are trying to bud up, and occasional fires. So, those factors really help to keep grasslands as grasslands, because again, seasonal drought prevents a lot of trees from growing. Large herbivores also eat back large shrubs and trees, and and fires are also going to help keep trees from growing here. You'll see the odd tree here and there. Those trees like this acacia tree are covered with thorns that help to keep those large herbivores away. They're also drought resistant. Savannas. Tropical savannas in places like Africa have hooved animals like gazelles, zebras, giraffes, and antelopes. And they have their predators like lions or humans or hyenas. And you'll see those things migrating throughout these grasslands looking for water, because of this huge seasonal variation. So in the summer months, if you are a large grazing animal, you're going to need water from somewhere, so you're going to have to move throughout this area to find it. And if you're the predator that hunts those, you're going to have to move to follow your food. We also have temperate grasslands, and in temperate grasslands, winters are usually very cold, summers are very hot and dry. Annual precipitation is sparse and is uneven. So again, that sort of like seasonal drought that keeps the trees and large shrubs out. Because the above ground parts of most grasses die and decompose each year, organic matter accumulates to produce a deep, fertile soil. The soil is held in place by a thick network of intertwined roots of drought-tolerant grasses, and unless somebody plows the topsoil up, and then those fertile soils are just blown away. And the grasses that live here are adapted to the fires that occasionally sweep through these areas. Cold grasslands or Arctic tundra, these are very, very cold places. The winters are very, very long and dark because they're so far north. There's a little bit of precipitation, but it's usually snow, and so it's not accessible to plants. Underneath the snow, after it falls, there is sort of like a spongy mat of low-growing plants, which are primarily grasses, mosses, and lichens. Trees and tall plants usually don't survive because it's too cold for them to live there most of the time. Most of the growth for these plants is happening in the summertime because the sun is shining there around the clock. It's pretty remarkable to be up in the far north and see how late the sun is out in the wintertime. It's kind of mind-boggling, actually. But yeah, that's when most of the growth is going to happen here, is when that sun is around all of the time. Something that happens because of this extreme cold, by the way, is called permafrost, which is underground soil in which captured water stays frozen for more than 2 consecutive years. And even, during the summertime, even though the sun is out 24 hours a day for part of it, the permafrost layer keeps melted snow and ice from soaking into the ground. And so there's a lot of shallow lakes, marshes, ponds that form because, again, the permafrost is keeping any of that surface water from actually getting into the ground. And so you have a whole bunch of mosquitoes living in those areas. Mosquitoes and flies and other things basically find themselves attracted to those really shallow pools. And those insects serve as a great food supply for all kinds of migratory birds that fly north for the winter. I'm sorry, fly north for the summer, south for the winter. Excuse me. And all the animals that live here have some sort of adaptation that they use. Thick fur, feathers that they use. They also have migratory patterns that they use to help them mitigate how cold it gets in the winter. And interestingly, there's a lot of areas in which permafrost is starting to thaw because of global climate change. And it's really bad because it not only does it disrupt ecosystems, but it also releases greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide. And we're going to talk about greenhouse gases shortly here. So anyway, moving on from deserts, the tundra is also an incredibly fragile biome just because of how slow soils are to regain nutrients. Not a lot of things die there because the growing season is so short, so not a lot of primary productivity. And so tundra soil is usually very slow to recover from any kind of damage or disturbance. Things like oil drilling, pipelines, mines, they all mess up tundras, and the tundra stays mess up for generations. Once you mess it up, it's pretty much gone for a really, really long time. Moving on, we're talking about temperate shrubland now. Temperate shrubland, also known as chaparral. So because these areas are close to the sea, they have a longer rainy season than temperate deserts have. And so the fog during the spring and fall reduce evaporation, allowing plants to keep more of their water. And these biomes are usually found along coastal areas of Southern California and the United States. And a great example of where you can find some chaparral is Henrico State Park, which is about an hour and a half east of here. Really super cool, magnificent area. And it's usually sort of low-growing evergreen shrubs. You see small trees there sometimes. And so Henrico is oak forest, but it is also chaparral. By the way. And during the long, warm, dry summers, chaparral vegetation usually becomes very, very flammable, and you get fires there fairly often from lightning or human activities, and those fires just really sweep through. Although chaparral is adapted, it's adapted to those fires, but we still have caused them to become overgrown by preventing every single fire that ever happens, and it's difficult for them to maintain when you have those human-started fires. People really like living in chaparral, and so we have been moving in. But one of the problems with moving into chaparral is, it is a fiery ecosystem, and so you can lose your house to it pretty easily. The next type of thing we're going to be talking about, the next biome, is forests. And I may be sounding like a broken record, but we have tropical, temperate, and cold or boreal forests. So tropical rainforests or tropical forests are found near the equator, which maybe you would expect. These are hot. These are very warm, as the name rainforest implies. And these have, year-round, fairly uniform temperatures. Fairly uniform temperature. Oh, that's up here. Sorry. Fairly uniform temperature all year round. There is some changes in precipitation. You have a dry season and you have a long wet season, but temperature is going to be fairly consistent throughout the year. Tropical rainforests are also a really a great example of stratification, or of what, like we talked about, resource partitioning to a pretty extreme level. And so stratification of specialized plant and animal niches in tropical rainforests allows all those different species to live together simultaneously. And we're going to talk about those different layers. There's really no wind in these rainforests, which is kind of interesting. So because there's such thick trees and vegetation, there's like no wind in any of these rainforests. And so a lot of species rely on bats, butterflies, birds, and bees to not only pollinate, but also to spread their seeds around. And because it's so warm there, anytime something dies, things decompose really quite quickly and are taken up again really quite quickly, because everything is trying to grow there all at once. And also because it is because of rain, the soils leach very quickly, and because of this, there is very little resources in the soil. There's very little nutrients available in the soil. Those nutrients are quickly taken up and stored by trees, vines, and other plants, which is very different from temperate rainforests, where most nutrients are held in the soil. A vast majority, I don't know if vast, but a majority of these forests have been already destroyed by human activities. We're destroying them, we're burning them down so that people can have farms and things like that. And this is going to have a pretty dramatic impact on Earth's overall biodiversity, because these rainforests hold up to, it's thought, maybe up to 25% of the species that exist in the world, which is pretty remarkable. And when you when you get rid of those things, it's going to not only increase global warming, but it's going to increase the spread of disease, like we've seen with the spread of COVID-19. Interestingly, a lot of the drugs that we get come from the rainforests themselves. They're from chemicals that we've been able to synthesize because we found a plant there that alleviates pain or helps us to digest or whatever it is. So tropical rainforests, very important. They're also being destroyed very, very quickly. The next category of forest is temperate forests or temperate deciduous forests. Deciduous means that it loses its leaves in the winter. So these are areas that have pretty moderate temperatures, but that change significantly with the season. You guys live in a temperate area, so you know what that's like. Long, hot summers, cold winters, but not typically too severe. It usually doesn't snow in these areas. The biome is dominated by a few species of deciduous trees like oak or poplar or beech. They survive the cold winters, again, by dropping their leaves and becoming dormant. Each spring, they regrow their leaves. And because decomposition is slow here, they usually have a layer of slowly decaying leaf litter, which is a great spot to store nutrients. This one has been disturbed by humans probably more than any other terrestrial biome. Because again, we clear forests for growing crops or to build houses. But, given maybe 100 or 2 years, like let's say we were all to leave the farms in the valley, if you gave them 100 or 2 years, they can return to deciduous forests through secondary ecological succession. So, we also in the East, we have removed a lot of large predators like bears or foxes or wolves or mountain lions because we've killed them off or displaced them, and they've been replaced mostly with like white-tailed deer and other small mammals. There are birds that will migrate there to feed and breed every year, but a lot of those are declining in number because of habitat fragmentation. They aren't able to get from one place to another, or because we are just killing them. We also have evergreen coniferous forests, which are called taigas or boreal forests. These are cold and are found south of the Arctic tundra, and in northern North America, Asia, and Europe. So for us, this would be like Canada. Winters are long and dry and very cold. And in northernmost taigas, winter sunlight is only available for 6 to 8 hours a day, which is not long. The winters are very short and cool. The sun will shine up to 19 hours a day, again, because you're so far north. Boreal forests are dominated by just a few species of coniferous. Coniferous means cone-bearing, so these are trees that have cones. But most boreal forests are dominated by a few species of coniferous, evergreen trees like spruce, cedar, pine trees, and they keep their needles year-round. And those needles the needles are an adaptation because they can withstand the intense cold and drought of winter. They also they allow the trees to not be super weighted down with snow. And plant diversity in these areas is typically low, especially when compared to rainforests, just because only a few species can deal with the very, very cold winters and the frozen soils. The sort of ground layer of these forests, partially decomposed conifer needles. Decomposition is slow because it's low temperatures, and the there's a waxy coating on the conifer needles, which results in like a high soil acidity. And those decomposing needles make for a nutrient-poor, acidic soil, which again prevents other plants from growing on the forest floor. Some things will grow there, but there's a lot of reasons why boreal forests aren't necessarily the most diverse when it comes to plants. All kinds of wildlife live there. You have things like bears, wolves, moose, lynx, wolverines. If you go far enough north, you run into caribou. You also have birds migrate there in the summer to eat insects and things like that. We also have coastal coniferous forests and temperate rainforests. Those are sort of scattered along the coasts here from Northern California through Washington. These are also called temperate rainforests. You have large conifers there like Douglas firs, and you have I can't think of the word. You have things like redwoods. And again, this is going along the coasts from here all the way up through Canada. So this isn't a biome per se. Mountains are still incredibly important regions. So mountains contain most of the world's forests, which obviously are habitats for a lot of biodiversity. They also provide habitats for endemic species that you can only find in the mountains. They are sanctuaries for animal species which have to leave lowland areas to go to higher altitudes, whether that's because of humans or because of climate change or whatever it may be. Mountains also help to regulate the climate of the earth. So they're covered with ice and snow, and it helps to cover and cool the earth and offset global warming. There's a concept called albedo, which has to do with how much energy is reflected off of something. And having a glacier on a mountain causes a whole lot of energy to get reflected off and prevents the earth from heating. And mountains can also affect sea levels by storing a bunch of water as glacial ice. But again, as the Earth continues getting warmer, mountaintop glaciers are going to melt, and that water is going to flow into the oceans. And as we talked about before, these also have a huge role in the hydrologic cycle because, again, they store a lot of water. In spring and summer, a lot of the water and ice melts and comes down into streams and rivers like the ones that feed the Central Valley, which allow us to do things like drink and irrigate our crops. But again, as we have less and less of that mountain snowpack, that water resource is going to be harder to find. And as you remember, very little of the Earth's water is actually fresh. So yes, mountain ecosystems are very important.